Now, for more analysis, we're joined by Dr. Geist Pinfold, a lecturer in international security at King's College London. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. Welcome to Asia One News. The United States has carried out a 6th consecutive night of strikes on Iran, while Tehran has expanded retaliatory attacks on US military sites across the Gulf. Does this indicate that the conflict has now entered a new and more decisive, dangerous phase?
It certainly suggests the conflict has entered a more dangerous phase, but I should stress we are not yet back to the open war that we saw in the earlier part of this year. First of all, it's worth noting that Israel is not involved. Iran has not hit Israel, and Israel has not hit Iran. This remains a conflict between the US and Iran. And of course, Iran has changed its targets compared to the previous round of fighting. Yes, it's still hitting the Gulf. It still sees the Gulf as the US's center of gravity, but it is primarily targeting some of the smaller Gulf states like Bahrain, like Kuwait. What it's trying to do here is to show the US its resolve, to show it can still cause trouble in the region, and that this is not going to go away anytime soon, but it's trying to hit smaller targets than, for example, the UAE or Dubai, for example, Abu Dhabi, those kind of areas which are the commercial and logistical hubs of the Gulf that would basically make a larger US response inevitable. So yes, we are escalating. Yes, this is more dangerous, but for the time being, neither side seems like they want to throw the entire region back into war just yet.
And Dr. Rob, you did mention it just there, but Iran says it has targeted US military installations in Bahrain, Kuwait and Syria. How significant is this expansion of the battlefield for regional security?
Well, it certainly takes us a few steps backwards. When there was a ceasefire earlier this year, the fire never really ceased, to be honest. More like tempering of the violence, a few degrees less intense than previously during the actual conflict. And then we had the Memorandum of Understanding. And the whole point of the Memorandum of Understanding was to get us out of this paradigm of no war, no peace, where both sides are negotiating, but they're also using force to try and signal resolve and get a better deal at the negotiating table. We can now say that even if we're not back to war, the Memorandum of Understanding has failed to achieve its goals. We are once again stuck in that escalating cycle, what we would call as academics the escalation ladder, where both sides feel like they cannot not retaliate against each other's attacks. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. The US took 2 months to respond to Iran's attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain. Now it has done. Iran is trying to show that it still controls the dynamics and sets the pace of the conflict by expanding it further to target, for example, Jordan and Qatar. So both sides are climbing up the escalation ladder. The region is in a more dangerous place, but we are still not yet back to open conflict.
And Dr. Rob, the Strait of Hormuz remains at the centre of this confrontation, with Iran saying it will never return to its pre-war status. What are the strategic implications of that statement?
Right, this is the key dilemma, the key, I guess, divergence between Iran and the West. The US, in particular, is saying to Iran, we will offer you sanctions relief for you to give up the Strait of Hormuz. You wanted sanctions relief from us for a very long time. We demanded that sanctions relief be conditional in exchange, for example, progress on the nuclear file. We're now not doing that. We're saying just give up the Strait of Hormuz. That's the US message. However, Iran is saying we might, Iran is signaling that they might want sanctions relief, but they want the Strait of Hormuz more. For Iran, they see it as more important a strategic interest than sanctions relief. Bear in mind that the US and Iran have been negotiating for a long time. There's a lot of bad blood between both sides. There's a feeling that the US can't be trusted. The Strait of Hormuz is a bird in Iran's hand, and it is very, very unwilling to give it up. It sees it as a way for it to cement its regional power, some would say regional hegemony, whereas sanctions are an intangible. They're something that is promised, but the US may or may not deliver.
And is there still a realistic pathway back to negotiations, or are military calculations now overshadowing diplomatic efforts?
Well, the negotiations are presumably at least still going on. We're hearing of mediators passing messages, for example, Pakistan and Qatar as well. So the talks are still going on. This is the difference between this and the war itself. Both sides are using force to try and signal resolve, to suggest that any deal that comes will be on their terms, not on their adversaries' terms. And neither side, and definitely not the US's regional partners or other countries in the region, no one really wants a return to war. But that, of course, does not preclude a return to war. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, because if both sides feel like they have no choice but to retaliate and escalate against another, we may well find ourselves back in that in where we were earlier this year, where there is an open and devastating conflict with enormous regional implications and, of course, second order effects felt worldwide in the global economy.
And finally, so what role can regional mediators, say like Pakistan or Qatar, realistically play in preventing the conflict from escalating even further?
Well, they are actively trying to stop the conflict from escalating further. Qatar, for example, the Qataris we heard are passing proposals to the Iranians. Pakistan is, of course, still involved. It's much more difficult from a Qatari position than it is the Pakistani one for the time being, because Qatar is actively being targeted and hit by Iran whilst it's involved in the negotiations. So it's a tight balancing act, because mediators traditionally suggest they have no skin in the game, that they're distant to the conflict, they're peripheral to it. That is not the case with either Qatar or Pakistan. Qatar is, of course, reliant on the Strait of Hormuz for a lot of its trade. It's a neighbor of Iran. Ditto, Pakistan is also a neighbor of Iran, albeit on the other side. So the potential consequences of instability and war will be felt throughout the region, including the mediators, which, at a guess, I would suggest they're working harder than ever to try and bring both sides back to the negotiating table and away from inching towards escalation.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.